Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our 8-week fall series, Vibing with the Venerables. The last two series that we had, the first one, 8 weeks on John of the Cross, and the second one on Therese of Lisieux, dealt with saints who were centuries away from our present context, so relevant and yet lived in an age very unlike ours. And so our effort in this series is to connect with really modern day, we might almost call them contemporary in the sense that they belong to the century. And so we have two men and two women, Oscar Romero, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Thea Bowman. And we will spend 2 weeks on each one of these we are calling venerable people. They're presented by theologians from the University of Dayton. Today we have Dr. Kelly Johnson, who is going to lead us to reflect on Dorothy Day. She is truly an authority in this matter. When I was doing my doctoral studies at the University of Dayton, if you knew Kelly Johnson, you knew Dorothy Day. And so Kathy Stout will talk about Thomas Merton. Dr. Cecilia Moore will talk about Thea Bowman. She's one of the lesser known of the Catholic venerables, but she was a nun, and I think in the context of our nation today and the struggle for racial equality, to reflect on an African American nun is truly something that we need to do at this hour. And then you have Oscar Romero, Saint Oscar Romero now, Archbishop Oscar Romero, and I will be reflecting on that once Kelly has finished her sessions. So it is in many ways to find the spirituality, the life, the history, the theology, and inspiration from these men and women who have graced our century. Well, the last century, really. So I want to introduce to you Dr. Kelly Johnson. She is the current Father William J. Ferry Chair of Social Justice at the University of Dayton. She works across the university to generate, advance, and sustain influential scholarship, teaching, and community engagements that advance social justice in pursuit of the common good. I have the highest regard and respect for Kelly Johnson. In fact, I'm very, very honored. In fact, we should all be honored to have a scholar of such great caliber with us here this evening. If you want to look her up more, one of her writings, her book is The Fear of Beggars: Stewardship and Poverty in Christian Ethics. And so here we are with Dr. Kelly Johnson talking about Dorothy Day. Welcome.
Thank you, Father Satish, and thank you for rearranging the schedule to accommodate my needs. It's really nice to see some folks here and to be with other folks who are with us online. So we're going to be talking about servant of God, Dorothy Day. I've included in the readings a short biography which will sort of get you up to date with the fact that this title, servant of God, means she is on the road toward canonization, although that can be a rather long road, and in the case of Dorothy Day will no doubt be a controversial one. So the plan is that tonight I'm going to lead you in thinking about the way she tells the story of her conversion so that you can see how she understands both the wonder and the goodness of creation and the deep disorder of sin in her own life and in the world, and a profound calling to the life of grace. So then from that perspective, we'll be ready next week to think about the work for which she is best known. I call it evangelization. Other people might call it stirring up a lot of trouble. So we'll see about that next week. Now, many, though not all Catholics, know a good bit about Dorothy Day. She has become pretty well known. You may know that she was one of the 4 Americans that Pope Francis referenced when he addressed the joint houses of Congress during his visit to the US. The only woman in those 4. But I think among those who do know her, if you don't know her, just ignore this part and you can come back in a minute. If you do know something about Dorothy Day, I think that she is oftentimes now misunderstood, mischaracterized, because we tend to see her through options that are more familiar to us, stereotypes that we have. It is true that she was outraged by systems that justify destitution continuing even in the midst of wealth, that she attacked hypocrisy, that she opposed militarism, that she engaged in very public, controversial struggles over labor rights, and that she was a single lay woman navigating a 20th century Catholic Church that didn't usually feature at that time a lot of lay leadership, certainly not a lot of women in lay leadership, not a lot of lay women who were not in vowed communities. So she was quite an extraordinary figure in that way. And there's a temptation then to read her as social justice, progressive feminist. It's an easy way to understand her, but it's misleading. There's, in fact, a movie about Dorothy Day that's out there, Entertaining Angels, and just in case you've seen Entertaining Angels, I don't like it. I think it's misleading in exactly that way. So I'm going to tell you Dorothy's story tonight in the terms that she used for it, which I think really changed the way we might understand her and challenge us to expand our imaginations outside the bounds of the stereotypes that we're more accustomed to, both by thinking about what the faith was like earlier in the 20th century and by encountering a thinker who simply doesn't fit neatly into our categories of left and right. So let me tell you a little about Dorothy's life. She wrote the definitive account of her conversion to Catholicism in a book called The Long Loneliness, which is a great title. Hard to come up with a great title, but that's a great title. The whole story is about this long loneliness, this hunger for communion. It's a longing for friendship, for family, for love, for social bonds, for a society of people who care about each other, and for our communion with God. You only have that longing for something because you already know something about the thing you long for, right? The longing itself gives us some indication that we know where we're going. And this is not a sad book. When it says the long loneliness, that might sound a little depressing. It's a hunger after the beloved, right? And you already know the beloved when you're hungering after them. So there is a lot of joy in this story. She liked to quote Catherine of Siena, who said, "All the way to heaven is heaven, because Jesus said, I am the way." So she tells the story of this longing in her life very consciously, referring to the most famous autobiography of a Christian conversion, which is Augustine's Confessions. The readings I give you include the beginning of this autobiography, and the very opening section is about going to confession. And this is a nod in the direction of this book called The Confessions, Story of a Conversion. And that story, Augustine's story, is where we get this very famous quotation, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O God." So as Dorothy Day tells the story of her restless heart looking for rest in God, it moves through 3 acts. And she calls the first one searching, the second natural happiness, and the third, love is the measure, which again comes from another quote. I forgot to look up which saint said this. The measure of love is to love without measure. So, like Augustine, she starts by describing her childhood. The slide I've put up is a reference to a very important moment in Dorothy Day's childhood. She and her family lived in San Francisco during the San Francisco earthquake, 1906. Terrible earthquake followed by a devastating fire. She would have been 8 or 9 years old at the time that this happened in San Francisco. And she writes about what happened in the aftermath of the earthquake. when there was such devastation, so many people fleeing for their lives, so many had lost everything overnight. And she writes about the joy of doing good, of sharing whatever we had with others after the earthquake, an event which threw us out of our complacent happiness into a world of catastrophe. All the neighbors joined my mother in serving the homeless. Every stitch of available clothing was given away. This is a very important moment in Dorothy Day's life. She spends years after this wondering why, when in a moment of crisis, and I think we've seen this recently in Dayton, if you think about the tornadoes from a few years ago, there's a huge outpouring of mutual care for each other that in our ordinary lives we can't seem to sustain. And the question for Dorothy is always, why can't we sustain that outside of that kind of catastrophe? So her family had to start over again in Chicago. Her father had lost his job, they moved there, were living in poverty. But in those years, she talks about having a childhood friend who would tell her stories of the saints, a Catholic friend. And she writes, "How my heart almost burst with desire to take part in such high endeavor. Enlarge thou my heart, O Lord, that thou mayest enter in." She writes about running around in a neighbor's apartment looking for her friend, thinking she could find her friend. She ran in the open door and barged into the bedroom where the mother was kneeling down in prayer. And the mother, not a good Catholic woman, she was kneeling there probably saying her rosary, glanced up, saw the kid run in the room, told her where the friends had gone and where she could find them, and then turned back to her prayer. This was very new for Dorothy. Her family was not religious. And she writes, "I felt a burst of love toward her that I have never forgotten. A feeling of gratitude and happiness that warmed my heart. It was she who taught me what to do." So child Dorothy, from seeing this woman kneeling and praying, takes to reading the Psalms and actually started for a while going to church. She went to an Episcopal church for a while when she was a child. She wrote, let's go back there. She wrote, "Whenever I felt the beauty of the world in song or story, in the material universe around me, or glimpsed it in human love, I wanted to cry out with joy. I always felt the common unity of our humanity. The longing of the human heart is for this communion. All you works of the Lord, bless the Lord, and praise him and glorify him forever." So, very passionate child with a very strong sense of the beauty of God and the call to the life of prayer. So she began also reading news stories and novels about the conditions of labor. Now, this was the early 20th century. So just to remind you, at this time, there were no legal requirements about minimum wage, no limits on the hours that people had to work in their workplaces. The struggle for the 40-hour week went on for years. There were no safety inspections in factories, no rights if you were injured on the job. Child labor was still legal. And movements of workers who were banding together to protect each other and to insist on their humanity and to try to make change in the world were doing so even at risk of the loss of their own life. We forget this now, right? That struggle cost people their lives. So she was reading stories about this and found in it this spirit of communion, right? This solidarity, people sacrificing for love of each other. She was very moved by it and walked the streets of Chicago for hours and hours, watching the lives of working people, listening to the music that came out of the taverns, smelling the smells of food that they cooked, and thinking about how she could be part of making change in the injustice in the world. So she did go for a couple of years to the University of Illinois. She's one of their most famous dropouts. One of the notable episodes from that time is that she said she was very impressed by a professor who solemnly told her that you shouldn't make fun of religion because weaker people need religion. It's important for them. Of course, what she learns from this is if you're a strong person, you should not need religion, and she, being one of the strong people, needed to push that aside. Even with her own strong sensibilities about faith, her own history of prayer and of love, of worship, she, in this era, began to see in religious practice a lot of hypocrisy. She saw church people fawning on the rich and ignoring the great struggles, not participating in the sacrifice that was going on to try to change the injustice being done to workers in the world. So she moved away from the church and she became a socialist. By the way, in that picture, she's right in the middle of the back row, that solemn person with the big mop of hair there. It's Dorothy. To her father's dismay, while she was still a teenager, she moved to New York City and started working as a journalist in radical newspapers, still a teenager, in the early 1900s. So this is quite remarkable. She threw herself into a life of radical activism and hung around with edgy young writers, some literary geniuses. One of her friends was the playwright Eugene O'Neill, and she writes about sitting in the back room of a bar in the middle of the night with Eugene O'Neill reciting to her this long poem, The Hound of Heaven, which is a long saga of the soul running away from this threatening presence behind it, which turns out to be the divine love that's been pursuing it. So this was a very exciting time to be in New York in the 19-teens during these radical movements trying to bring about social change. There was so much moral energy and courage and creativity. But it's important to know that when Dorothy writes about that time in her life, she writes about another thread running through it. And she captures the sense of this in, actually, it's a very small episode in the story, but it has a big importance. And for those of you who are fans of Augustine's Confessions, you might think of this as a parallel to the story he tells about stealing some pears in his childhood. Sounds like an innocent misdemeanor, but as he unfolds it, it becomes the core of everything that's wrong with the sinful soul. So in her story, she was attending a fundraiser, a dance in support of some radical cause, and a young man she didn't like, she wasn't fond of, who I guess he had a crush on her, he was always running around after her, came running out and grabbed her, and she slapped him. And he slapped her back. And this turned into a kind of a brawl with other people jumping in to pull him off and act, to protect her. And it was in the newspapers, they got pictures of it. And she looks back on it and says, she says, I wasn't trying to be a good Christian at that point, but I thought I was a good radical. I thought I was committed to solidarity and the struggle for human dignity, changing society towards equality, and look what I did. Right? I slapped this poor guy. I shoved him away. I acted violently against somebody he was kind of an oddball. She didn't want to be associated with him because he was kind of weird. Her pride and her vanity and her impatience complicated her desire to be among the poor and working for justice. She began to ask, am I really working for justice, or am I just wanting to hang around people who drink a lot? Right? She discovered in the midst of the very good work that she wanted to be part of, this courageous solidarity with the poor, a thread of pride, so that even this best work she was involved in was turning out to be an occasion of sin. Now, she doesn't write in the book, and she didn't discuss the darkest elements of that time in her life. We do know about them now. She had 2 terrible love affairs with men who were not faithful to her at all. One of them insisted that she have an abortion, which she did, and it was so traumatic that she thought she would never be able to have a child. She attempted suicide. So in the midst of this life that was supposed to be all about communion and love and human connection, she was finding a path tending toward death. This searching of hers that was so full of instincts that would lead her toward God also now was becoming a torment that was leading her toward self-destruction. So I want to step back from the storytelling for just a minute to show you some of the theology that she's relying on there. Dorothy Day is a journalist. She's specialized in the human interest story. She's a great storyteller. But underneath these stories, she's been thinking theologically. She's been learning a lot about the faith, and there is some deep theology underneath it. So, as I said, she's drawing a lot on the model of Augustine's writing in this book. And she's interweaving sort of the best of human impulses and this death dealing of sin in a very Augustinian way. So Augustine said, look, here's the problem. He said, everything God makes has to be good. If it comes from God, it is good. God made everything. Therefore, everything must be fundamentally good. So where does evil come from? Because we experience it. So Augustine's answer was, evil is just sort of good that's lost its way. It's good that's turned away from its right purpose. It's gotten kind of twisted or out of order. And because it's not directed toward its fulfillment, toward God, it's tending toward death, toward self-destruction. And that's what we experience as evil. Note to you, this means you should never say something is pure evil. There is no such thing as pure evil. If it's pure evil, it doesn't exist. What we experience as evil is always some good that has gotten twisted, right? Turned away from its end. So the tragedy of this early part of the story, of Dorothy Day's story, is that this beauty and this longing for God and the love of humanity are, with just a little twisting, turned into arrogance and violence, self-hatred and self-destruction. These great goods, with a little turning, become what we experience as evil. So I want to invite you for a minute to reflect. If you're here, you maybe want to talk to others. If you're online, maybe you've got somebody with you could talk to. Maybe you want to do a little journaling. I want you to invite you to reflect for a minute on your own life. Can you see in your experience how some of the greatest goods and the noblest impulses and the truest truths you hold on to are, on the one hand, leading you to God, and on the other, with just a little turning, right, can lead you into your own pride, down a very different kind of path, so that they become damaging to the soul. See, our movement toward God isn't about the good guys versus the bad guys, or the good places versus the bad places. What Augustine and what Dorothy is getting us to see are, it's all about whether we are acting for the love of God or whether we're just acting for ourselves. So take a moment and consider in your own life some of the greatest goods and the noblest impulses that have been leading you toward God. Are there ways that those also become occasions for your own pride? I'll leave you with that for just a minute. Well, we've only started Dorothy's story, right? We're still in the very early years. I love this photo. Newspaper clipping. The headline says, "Getting close to nature's heart. Dorothy Day, youthful author." Right? There she is, out communing with nature. So what had happened was that Dorothy wrote a novel, and it got published, and it got optioned for a movie, so she got a little money. And with the proceeds of that money, she bought a little beach house out on Staten Island. It's a time of healing for her after those early years. She met and fell in love with and developed a faithful relationship with a man named Forster. He'd been part of her circle before, but she hadn't known him well in the earlier days. And they were able to live together in this place of great natural beauty. And in her autobiography, she writes about this as a time of, she's surrounded by faithful, funny, silly, beautiful, odd friends, full of stories of their own sort of tragedies and joys. And she herself is filled with wonder and gratitude that she's found her way to such a good place. And then she becomes pregnant. She had thought this could never happen. She had given up on being able to have a child. She saw it as a miracle. And her great desire for this daughter when she was born, Tamar, was to protect Tamar from going through the kind of searching that she had gone through. So she stopped a nun on the street and asked her how she could get her baby baptized. The nun promptly said, "You can't baptize your baby if you're not Catholic yourself." Good old-fashioned nun, no nonsense. But here was the difficulty. In these days of labor movements in the early 20th century, what Dorothy Day had learned was that the church of the workers and the immigrants and the poor was the Catholic Church. She dropped in on Mass, sometimes after being up all night long partying. And she saw in Catholicism both a place for that longing that she had to give thanks, a way to offer praise to the one who had given her such a beautiful second chance in life. And also, the Catholic Church was for her a source of moral guidance. She was not at all anti-authoritarian. She wanted for her daughter not freedom from hierarchy, but freedom from the dissolute and prideful self. She said, "Do I have to obey myself? Do I have to do what I want? I need somebody else to help me with this." She was glad to have the church's moral guidance. But it was not easy for her to enter the church herself, as much as she wanted this for her child, and as much as she admired and was drawn toward the church. The complication was that the man she loved believed that marriage shouldn't be a matter of law, that the state, this violent, overweening authority, had no right to make decisions about people's love, that it was wrong, in fact, to treat marriage as a matter of law, and so he refused to be officially legally married. And he was also not at all sympathetic to Dorothy's desire to be Catholic. He saw religion as a way not of thanking the creator of all the beauty of the world, but a way of ignoring the beauty of the world by looking for something beyond it. Now, Dorothy was studying catechism, getting ready to have the baby baptized. She had a priest she was consulting with, and the priest said, "Okay, let's take this carefully and slowly. This man is the father of your child. You've had a long-term, good, stable, monogamous relationship. We want to try to save this relationship. Be gentle, take it easy, try to win him over," right? But Dorothy Day is not a very mild-mannered person. I don't know if you've caught on to this from the earlier part of the story. Pretty passionate, pretty intense person. And her lover was as well. And they fought, and they fought, and they fought until she couldn't take it anymore, and she locked him out, and she went and got baptized. Okay, so that's how Dorothy Day found her way to the Catholic Church. This is the crux of the story. Here's what I want you to notice. The spiritual danger at this point, the real crisis in this story about life on the beach with this man, Forster, the father of her child, having a baby, the real crisis in this story is not that she'll do something evil. The danger is that she'll hold on to the good she has and never move on to the better. That's the real risk in this moment, right? The move she makes is to give up these tremendous goods she's found, a faithful, loving, intimate relationship with a man who's good to her, this network of radical friendships, the work that she has had in networks of people who are very opposed to Catholicism. She leaves that behind because she knows there's a greater good that she's called to. Now, Dorothy learned later in life to call this move sowing, not S-E-W, right, but S-O-W-I-N-G, sowing. So let me see if I can explain that. It's a cake, yeah. So one image we sometimes work with about the spiritual life is it's like a cake with icing. So the cake is things like having enough food and clothes and having some friendships, having some social standing and good work and some leisure. And if you've got all that stuff, you've got a pretty good piece of cake. Now, it would be nice, we think, if you also had the icing, which would be things like prayer, right? The sacraments, the hope of eternal communion with God. But in this way of imagining the spiritual life, you could have human life without prayer, without grace, without the sacraments, and it would be pretty daggum good. The spiritual life is a sort of an extra added on. That's one image. Now, this is a mistaken image. I had a slide where I had a big X through it, but I hated to put a big X through a nice piece of cake. There's a problem with this image for the spiritual life. Actually, there are two problems with it. One is that the world is broken by sin. So even if we have all of those things, which it's good for us to have, food and clothing and friends and love and good work, we still need grace. I kind of hate to say this, but it's sort of like, if you want to go with this image of cake, what Christians know about the brokenness of the world, the disorder of the world, is that it's a really good cake, but it's got some mold in it. And you can't just have the cake and say it's going to be great without fixing the problem in it, the sinfulness, the brokenness of the world. We need grace. Her life of seeking was not a piece of pretty good cake that just needed some icing added onto it. It was a really good life that also had this deep, deep disorder in it that led toward violence and death. The second problem is not just that the cake is troubled by sin, to go with that, but that human nature, we're made for something beyond ourselves in grace. We're not complete without God, without the grace that's given in the sacraments, without a life of prayer. Dorothy Day's story of her life is set up to show us that natural life, even when it got really good, even when she lived on the beach with a man who loved her and had a new baby, even when it was really good, it wasn't good enough in itself. If she had stayed there, if she had tried to stay in that happiness, she could not have found her fulfillment. So the image of the cake and the icing doesn't really work. Let me give you a better image. This is the image I want you to hang on to, because this is the image that Dorothy uses for the spiritual life. She talks about, she learned from a spiritual teacher about life as sowing the good seed. She saw that natural happiness, that life on the beach, that kind of happiness as a seed. And for her, what she had to do was let it fall to the ground and die so that it could bear fruit 100-fold. If she tried to hold on to it, the seed would never become what it was meant to be, so she sows it. So the risk she's showing us in this life at the beach is not that she would choose something evil. The risk is that she would try to stay there in these very good things and so never find the good that she was actually called to. This is her spirituality, to sow natural happiness, to sow our love of good food and of comfort, not because those are bad things, they're really good things. You only have to read Dorothy Day talking about food. She clearly loved good food. But we sow our love of those things, of our love also of recognition, of security, even our love of privacy. Not because they're bad things, not out of shame, not out of self-hatred, because we're punishing ourselves. We sow them because they are lesser goods, and we're called to a greater good. Now, the person who taught Dorothy Day to think this way is this guy, Father John Hugo. He taught her we don't just give up what is sinful. I mean, I think we think the language of giving up, right? This is a thing you do in Lent, and you do it because you're sinful, and that's fine. I don't have anything against that. But Father Hugo said we should also abstain from good things for the love of God, to make sure that our hearts are oriented toward that love, that we're not caught up in loving something lesser. The Christian life is this dying to self, and so it is challenging, but it's not miserable. It's not destructive. Dorothy's story, as we go on, is going to be a story of great joy. And Hugo understood that we have duties we have to fulfill. And we need consolation, we need encouragement. He didn't mean, when he talked about sowing these natural goods or abstaining from things to redirect our love, he didn't mean you should stop having birthday parties. You need times and places for enjoyment. We need things that refresh us and encourage our souls. You certainly don't want to harm your health. You don't want to get in the way of the ability to do the work that you're called to. But there are still many occasions, even setting those things aside, many occasions where we can take steps, small and large, to turn from those natural goods, not because they're bad, but because we are called to something better. So to take a completely different analogy, I don't have a picture for this one, but I think you'll be able to imagine it. Okay, here's the scene. Two people in love, one of them kneels down and says, "I love you, will you share the rest of your life with me?" And holds out a box, got a diamond ring in it. And the partner opens the box and looks at the ring and says, "Oh my God, this ring is gorgeous. Look at that. Look at how many carats is this? That setting, this is amazing, in the shape and the cut, and oh my God, it fits my hand. That looks so good on me. I love this ring." And what's happened? Right? The ring is good. There's nothing wrong with the ring, assuming it's not a blood diamond, right? There's nothing wrong with the ring. The ring, though, is supposed to be a sign of this entry into sharing life with each other, a sign of the love. And what Father Hugo is saying is, we have a tendency, this is our fallen nature, we have a tendency when God gives us gifts to go, "Wow, that is the best ring ever," and to forget that those gifts are an invitation into sharing life with God, into being in love with God. So if you knew that couple, you might say to them, "You guys, maybe you need to put the ring away for a few months. Let's put the ring away for a few months and work on this thing about loving each other and see if you can do this. And then once you got that going strong, then we can bring the ring back out. And it can be a good sign of the commitment you're making to each other." You set the good aside because there's a better that you're called to. Right? This is the move that Dorothy makes. So let's see how this plays out in Dorothy's life, though. On to the next part of the story. This is Dorothy and her daughter in the years after her conversion to Catholicism. Having left behind that natural goodness in order to become Catholic, Dorothy struggled for some years to figure out how to make sense of her life as a whole. As a Catholic, she had cut her ties to Forster, who wouldn't marry her, who was opposed to her being Catholic. But she had also cut her ties to the people she had worked with in the past, those newspaper people, the radical activists she'd been part of, because at that time in the US, because those radicals were so opposed to organized religion, she could no longer, as a Catholic, be part of those movements. Now, her confessor was understanding about this. She also had to earn a living, so sometimes she still did write for those papers when she needed some income. But she was moving out of that, trying to find other kinds of work. She had to move out of those circles. So what was the work now for her? What was her place as a Catholic? How would she use her talents? She went in the 1930s, early in the 1930s in the Depression, she went to cover a march on Washington where homeless and unemployed people from all over the country showed up in Washington demanding that the government address the crisis of the Depression. But she found herself on the sideline in that action, right? She was a journalist covering it, but she wasn't part of any of the movements that were doing this work. And this was very disturbing for her. This heart that was so much about being in communion, in solidarity with other people, struggling with people toward what was good, sacrificing herself. How could she be on the sidelines? And so she went into the church and made a prayer, she says, with tears and groaning, that a way would open up for her to serve the poor as a Catholic. And when she got home, be careful of the prayers you make, because God does answer them. When she got home, Peter Morin was waiting for her. So I'll tell you more about Peter later, but Peter was the one who taught Dorothy and opened up for her this path that she was praying for, a way for her as a Catholic to be involved in that work for justice. Dorothy Day didn't know anything about Catholic social tradition. She didn't know anything about what the popes had been writing about the conditions of labor. Peter taught her all of that, and he taught her the church's larger tradition of wisdom and practice for renewing human society. Peter taught her that the Catholic Church had a way to make a society in which it is, this is what he said, easier to be good. He was a realist. He wasn't trying to make utopia. He wasn't imagining that we could turn everything right. He said, we can make a society in which it is easier to be good. And his path was not campaigning to gain power in government. He was urging Catholics and fellow travelers to take personal responsibility themselves directly. Don't ask the politicians to do it, right? Don't wait for the experts to come. Do it yourself, in your own home, in your own neighborhoods, in your own parish. Build new structures out of love of God and neighbor, and do it at a personal sacrifice, right? This is connected to Dorothy's sowing. Give up your own natural goods for love of another. Peter writes, am I doing on time? Peter writes, he had this way of writing. He could declaim these short little sing-song poems. I think of them as almost like a early 20th century form of rap, sort of, not exactly. Okay, so this is the way Peter would write. He said, in the first centuries of Christianity, the hungry were fed at a personal sacrifice, the naked were clothed at a personal sacrifice, the homeless were sheltered at a personal sacrifice. And because the poor were fed and clothed and sheltered at a personal sacrifice, the pagans used to say about the Christians, see how they love one another. In our own day, the poor are no longer fed, clothed, and sheltered at a personal sacrifice, but at the expense of the taxpayers. And because the poor are no longer fed, clothed, and sheltered, the pagans say about the Christians, see how they pass the buck. How's that? So Peter had a whole theory. He had a whole vision of how this could be done. And he wanted Dorothy to start a newspaper. She's a journalist. She knew newspapers. He had ideas. He wanted her to start a newspaper to spread these ideas. And that is, in fact, what they did. They had a paper that existed to teach Catholics their own tradition, and as they described it, to show Catholics that Catholicism had a better answer to social disorder than communism did. That Catholicism had a better answer than these movements that Dorothy Day had been involved with had. Now, I call this evangelization, speaking good news to stir hearts and to draw out action. Words have power. And no sooner was Dorothy Day writing these words, putting out this newspaper, than people started turning up at her door, people in need saying, hey, you want to do some direct action? Here I am. What are we going to do? So the newspaper they started, called The Catholic Worker, turned into a movement, also called The Catholic Worker, a movement all across the United States and indeed around the world. And so Dorothy Day became the mother of a huge family, with all the hilarity and the struggle and the joy that a huge family entails. And it was a life in which she could grow in the love of God and of her neighbor, using all of her talents in the service of the church and of humanity. That grain of wheat fell and died and became a rich harvest. So I put this picture in just because we need something in color. You get used to seeing these things in black and white, right? And it seems so long ago and it all seems kind of drab. This is from Brother Mickey McGrath's book called Saved by Beauty, which, if you're looking for an introduction to Dorothy Day, that really focuses on her prayer life, I definitely recommend this one, Saved by Beauty, with the illustrations by Mickey McGrath. This image, this is the Lower East Side, where she was in New York. I think it captures something of the character of Dorothy Day's writing. This a colorful, vibrant, live place full of odd characters with their own quirks. Love of neighbor for Dorothy Day was never love of humanity in the abstract. Her writing and her life were full of people who have names. They're not just people in need. They're people who have senses of humor, right? People who have weird tics and funny taste. There are people that she knew and she lived with. They became part of her family. She opened her home to them. She shared her life with them. This is the love of the people that she comes to know by living and working with them, people she shares space with in the world, and she knows each one of these people is beloved of God. Each one of them is another Christ, and she loves them as though they are another Christ. They are God that she's encountering when she encounters them. Love of neighbor is for her this encounter with the love of God, and finding communion with her neighbors is the movement of this long loneliness toward its fulfillment, toward its beloved. Okay, so some key elements of this spirituality in summary. Here's one: everything that God makes is good. I hope that you'll have a chance to read some of Dorothy Day's writings. They are the sense of her love and gratitude for the world and for the people in it, in all of its weirdness, in all of its particularity, is really amazing. She's a beautiful writer about that, and she's writing from the heart. That's how she sees the world. Everything that God makes is good. And our souls are made to praise that God. When we're moved by the beauty of the world to that praise of God, that is exactly the movement that we are made for. But when we are attached to those goods in a way that focuses on them and not on God, then those beautiful goods actually become obstacles to our fulfillment. They become obstacles to our happiness. So if we're going to love God and delight rightly in the world, find joy in this good world that God has made, then we have to train our souls not to cling to those goods. We don't do that in shame. We don't do it in self-destruction. We don't do it because we're so proud of how much self-control we have. These are all temptations. We do it so that we can be looking at the person who's proposing to share a life of love with us and not just staring at the diamond ring, right? Now, this spirituality is absolutely integral to Dorothy Day's life. It's in small personal disciplines. She tried not to eat between meals. She tried to stop smoking. Actually, this is another caution about this. Dorothy Day was a heavy smoker. She tried to stop smoking as a way of sowing that desire. Her confessor told her she had to start smoking again because she was making everybody else miserable. I mean, this is one of these judgments you have to make about sowing your goods. If your pursuit of holiness is making everybody around you miserable, you want to kind of back off. Her confessor told her, your job is to pray every day that God will free you from your addiction. And eventually, she was able to stop smoking, right? But did it in a way that wasn't making everybody else in her community completely miserable because she was having nicotine fits. So she did it in those ways, in these little kind of personal ways. But it's very clear for Dorothy, this is not just an individual discipline. As she thought about it, as Peter Morin thought about it, this willingness to turn away from the goods of earth for the love of God is the heart of the Christian way of renewing society. At the core of their vision for how we fix the ills of the world is voluntary poverty, taken on for the love of God. Dorothy Day wrote, and this is in one of the texts that I gave you to read, she wrote, "The love of the humanity of our Lord is the love of our brother. The only way we have to show our love of God is by the love we have of our brother. And as Father Hugo likes to say, you love God as much as the one you love the least." Love of brother means voluntary poverty, stripping oneself, putting off the old man, denying oneself. So this means asking ourselves in every place, in every action, whether what we're doing is for the love of God. And that will lead us back directly, into love for our fellow humans. In order to love our fellow humans, we, in our world, this is definitely true, we have to sow those good seeds, give up our creature comforts, not because they're evil, but as an act of love for God and love of our brothers and sisters. Give up those creature comforts, let go of our tight hold on our security, even our privacy. She says, while our brothers suffer, we must suffer with them. We must take the risks and share in their suffering for love, giving up participation in work that exploits and harms people, even if that sets our material prospects back. She said, as richly as you sow, that's how richly you reap. How much will you sow? That's how rich the harvest will be. The measure of love is to love without measure. Now, this voluntary poverty, I want to be clear, this is not the same as destitution. She makes a clear distinction. There is this forced, grinding poverty that tears people down, that breaks the heart. It damages families. It denies human dignity. That's not what she's advocating. That's what she's spending her life fighting against, right? When she talks about voluntary poverty, she's talking about taking on this pain for love of brothers and sisters and for the love of God. But the difference between voluntary poverty and destitution, in her practice at least, is not that one of them is clean and safe and nice and the other one isn't. Her practice of voluntary poverty, she was not kidding about this. She and her community practiced, and many Catholic workers still practice, a kind of voluntary poverty that means not having a private place to sleep, dealing with poor quality food that's shared among many people, enduring things like bed bugs, poor heating, dealing with the noise of many people being together when we like to have our quiet and our chosen music to listen to without the irritation of other people. And it also means the joy of family, of community. And it means a spiritual life where you learn the delight of living in the trust of God's care. You know, the Catholic workers have been known, when they run out of money, to take turns praying in front of the statue of St. Joseph at the parish down the street. They would go down there and at all hours for 24 hours have somebody always there praying in front of the statue of St. Joseph for the things that they needed. They called it picketing St. Joseph. So Dorothy said when they really needed something, they always got it. And if they didn't get it, they found that they hadn't really needed it. As she tells it, this is a life of freedom. It's the freedom to love God above all else. To be so caught up in the praise of God that you can love to folly. Love everyone. See Christ in everyone and love with all that you have. Okay, so wrapping this up, we're accustomed to think about the spiritual life, talk about the love of God, thinking about that as something that's interior and something that's basically individual, right? A practice for ourselves, maybe for our family. I think Father Satish has worked for a very long time in this parish to help people to think differently about that call. But it's a strong urge to see the spiritual life as interior and private, therefore. But for Day, the language of the gospel, this let the seed fall to the ground and die, that is both a word to the heart and a word to society. The spiritual disorder in one is closely connected to the spiritual disorder of the other. The fulfillment of one is connected to the fulfillment of the other. So next week, I'm going to lead you in thinking about how Dorothy faced the scale and complexity of the problems of justice in the world. I'll tell you this, she didn't despair. She didn't give up. She lived in joy and confidence that God is working in us in ways that we barely know. And so our job is to keep following. But more about that next week. For Day, all of her life's work was in praise and obedience to God, in gratitude to the church for its traditions and sacraments, and her willingness to be different and to be difficult when that was necessary for the love of God. On her grave is inscribed, Deo gratias, thanks be to God. Right. So, some thoughts I want to leave you with for the week coming, your assignment, should you choose to accept it. During the coming week, I hope you'll be particularly attentive to the beauty of the created world, and especially where that beauty is happening in the midst of its brokenness. Dorothy listened to opera in a slum in the Bowery. She would see a shaft of light falling on a daisy in a jam jar in the midst of a house in poverty and be moved with gratitude to God. Look for the beauty that exists even in our brokenness. How is God's goodness present even where we see disorder? It is all made good. And I hope that this reflection will lead you this week to particularly focus in your prayer on praise and gratitude. This is the very center of our calling. And you may also this week ask yourself, reflect some on what kind of good in your life could you sow to give your heart more freedom to love God, right? It's not about punishing yourself. It's not about hating anything. It's not about ambition. This is simply, is there something you could set aside so that you could love the giver, love God, rather than focusing on the good itself? Okay, so next week we'll pick up and talk about the work that Dorothy did with the rest of her life as she gave thanks to God. I'll look forward to seeing you then. Do you guys have questions? I'd love to hear your thoughts. We have a microphone here, so those of you who are in person don't be shy, come up and speak into the microphone so everybody who's joining us online can hear as well. Somebody's coming. This is good.
It always strikes me as interesting that we have thinkers like Dorothy Day who put forward these ideas, and this was, 100 years ago, and it doesn't seem like we've made a lot of progress. And I guess I'm just curious how we as Christians don't really seem to pick up on that message, which seems to be the one that we hear from people that we look up to. Pope Francis talks about these things, and yet we don't really seem to do anything about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah. I hope everybody was able to hear that. These beautiful ideas which we hear from other spiritual leaders, but we seem to be remarkably able not to listen to them or to find ways to not practice them. So I think that's a real question that we have to ask ourselves. I think it's a question that every one of us has to ask ourselves. I would say that the way Dorothy and Peter approached this was not so much to lay guilt on people, why aren't you getting on it? But Peter's approach was to tell people, to remind people of their God-given dignity. And one of the things I'm going to talk about next week is their commitment to believing that the little things matter. The thing you can do matters. When I was young, I was reading Dorothy Day, right? I was that very passionate young teenager. I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to sell all. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to live in the midst of poverty, do my writing. And I tried for a while living in the midst of poverty and doing my writing, and I'm going to tell you, it is really hard. It is really hard. And I, in order to finish my writing, I moved away from that, right? From that kind of commitment. And I think while I continue to ask myself these same questions that I'm telling you guys to ask, right? What can I sow? What kind of freedom in my love of God could I adopt that I don't have? I think we also have to give ourselves room to say there are lots of different good ways to follow this call. And don't let the image of what Dorothy and Peter did stop you from believing that you are called to do something that is right in front of you, that you can do with your own hands in your own home. And it may not seem like much, but it never does seem like much when you start. And maybe it never will amount to much as far as the world can see. It amounts to much in God's eyes. So I would encourage you to take the step that you can, right? The thing that is in your hands, in your power, that you and your family or your neighbors can do. And and embrace that and see where it goes. Sometimes I think our very holding up of somebody like Dorothy Day as great becomes the problem for us, right? Because then we think if you're not Dorothy Day, you're not doing it. But every one of us is called in our own way to do this. Yeah. I didn't know. Father Satish, is there chat? Okay. I will say, having given all that pep talk, I do think that it is also important for us to speak this truth to each other. I know one of the things, and I found it hard in writing this talk to think, okay, if I say this to people, they're going to ask me, are you doing it? And I'm not doing it adequately. So, you know, what a hypocrite am I to talk about Dorothy Day? But then I thought, I have to say it, right? We have to say these things to each other and not worry that this isn't about my laying guilt on anybody else, and it's certainly not about my claiming that I've got anything going on right. But we have to talk about this as a way of freeing ourselves to dream bigger dreams, to answer the call with more courage in whatever way is appropriate in our own lives. So I hope that we'll all, as reflecting on Dorothy Day, be able to take up that charge to help more of us develop that kind of courage to answer the call. Yeah. So we'll pick this up next week. I'm so grateful that you guys are here. I'm so grateful that I've had the chance to spend this week thinking about Dorothy Day. I'll be thinking with you and praying with you all this week in gratitude and reflecting on where I can be sowing in my own life to increase my love of neighbor and my love of God. So I'll see you back here next week then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kelly. Now, as soon as this talk is over, there is an email going out to those of you who have registered. And if you haven't registered, you probably should. You could do that on the Faith Direct through the parish website. But what you want to get are materials that you can use during the course of the week, and an email should have gone. But it'll go at 8:30, and so you should find that in your mailbox. And as I said, if you've registered, you'll get them. If you're not registered, you can still register them for the upcoming talks. So thank you very much again, and see you next week, same time, 7 o'clock, for the rest of Dorothy Day. Good night, and God bless.
It's all Dorothy. She's such a good storyteller.